The heavy smell of damp earth, pine resin, and smoke permeated the air inside the hut, forming a thick, almost tangible veil behind which Raven hid from the world. He sat on a low weathered stump, carefully sharpening his knife. The blade, polished to a mirror shine, caught the dim light that penetrated through the only window covered with oil paper. This ritual, repeated day after day for many years, embodied his entire philosophy. Clarity of thought required a sharp tool, and a sharp tool required a steady, focused hand. The shadow, a silent, stocky man whose life was woven into the very fabric of the taiga, silently sorted through dried herbs in the corner, his movements economical and precise, like those of a forest predator. No unnecessary words, no explanations. Their coexistence was like the balance of two stones on the edge of a cliff, where each knew the weight and position of the other. Suddenly the silence, which was always filled with the invisible sounds of the forest, was pierced by a foreign, metallic screech. The sound of an engine, overcoming the last meters of a broken forest road. It was a loud, intrusive sound, carrying with it all the vanity and falseness of the world from which Raven had so diligently hidden himself. Raven did not raise his head, but slowed the movement of the whetstone. He knew that peace was never disturbed for trivial reasons, and if one of the city folk had found his refuge, it meant that their own desperation had reached its limit. A moment later, a massive figure appeared in the doorway. It was Ignatov, the head of the Regional Criminal Investigation Department, with whom Raven had once shared many a road and many a case. Time seemed to have carved new, harsh wrinkles on Ignatov's face and weighed down his shoulders with a burden of fatigue unrelated to physical labor. His uniform jacket was wrinkled, and his polished boots were covered with traces of clay and mountain dust. He was breathing heavily, not so much from the climb as from some inner heaviness he carried with him. Without saying a word, Ignatov nodded to Tenny and leaned against the doorframe, his eyes meeting Voron's gaze, full of undisguised, muffled supplication, covered by an official request. He did not try to feign the ostentatious disdain characteristic of city officials. He simply knew that only here, in this remote hut, could he find what could not be contained in any protocol. "Were you sent?" Voron asked hoarsely, continuing to slowly run the blade over the stone, his voice low and dry, like the rustle of fallen leaves. Ignatov gritted his teeth, as if getting rid of the last remnants of propriety. "Not exactly sent. I came on my own, but the higher-ups know I'm here. They need you to find instability." He pronounced the word instability as if it were part of some occult ritual rather than police jargon. Then, Ignatov quickly, incoherently, but extremely clearly outlined the essence of the incident. A prominent regional official, Mr. Kuznetsov, was found dead in a high mountain hunting lodge, 300 kilometers from civilization. The official version was that it was an accident. Either Kuznetsov had fallen from a steep, icy slope while walking, or, even more absurdly, had been shot in the chest while awkwardly cleaning his own rifle. Ignatov emphasized that the medical experts who arrived at the scene quickly confirmed that it was an accident, citing that everything fits, and the official's security guards, who immediately called the police, gave exhaustive testimony about how it all happened. Everything fits, Voron. It fits too smoothly, like a new suit that has never been worn, Ignatov said, pausing to catch his breath. He took a laminated report folded in four from his inside pocket and threw it on the table. Voron didn't even glance at it. City cops are always looking for something called a motive, or something called an alibi. You look for a straight trail that leads from the killer to the victim, like an arrow shot from a bow. You look for signs of a struggle, blood, fingerprints, something you can put in a folder and present in court. But you forget that a big lie is like a flood. It washes away everything obvious, leaving behind only a thin, barely noticeable film of silt where there used to be solid ground. Raven put down the knife. He was talking about methods he despised, about all this urban logic where the truth had to be digitized and entered into a database. His own method was different. He didn't read the evidence, but the very structure of the event, looking for a crack in the fabric of reality that lies always leave behind, like a careless word in a long speech. They want to close the case quickly and quietly. They've already promised everyone that it was just an accident that happened to Kuznetsov because of his carelessness. Ignatov admitted, lowering his head. There was no anger or indignation in his voice, only a bitter awareness of his own helplessness in the face of the system. But the thing is, Kuznetsov was a cautious man, to the point of pedantry. He never cleaned his weapon after sunset, and never approached the slope without safety equipment. The higher-ups know this, but this version suits them better. They're not looking for a killer, Raven. They're looking for someone who will confirm that there was no interference here. And if you confirm it, they'll be able to breathe a sigh of relief. But if you find a lie... He didn't finish. Raven understood. If he found the lie, it would become an inconvenient truth that would have to be either destroyed or hidden. That was why they sent Ignatov, knowing that Raven would not work against himself and would not follow the rules that restricted him. You are not seeking justice, Ignatov. Voron stood up. His height, which seemed even more imposing in the cramped space of the hut, made Ignatov involuntarily take a step back. You are looking for confirmation of your own blindness. He walked over to a small table and picked up a teapot. He didn't need to be told about the political intrigues or financial machinations that undoubtedly lay behind the official's death. These things were just window dressing. The real crime was always a violation of the unspoken, natural order. Kuznetsov had been killed. That much was clear to Voron, simply because Ignatov, despite his exhaustion, was here. Despair never lies. I'll go, said Voron. The shadow nodded without turning around, as if he had been waiting for this decision from the very beginning. But my conditions haven't changed. No papers, no protocols. You give me access, and I become a shadow for a while. No one should know that I'm there and what I'm looking for. I'm not looking at what you found, but at what you didn't see. If I stumble upon the truth, I'll decide what to do with it myself. You get your people out of the way, and give me 3 days. Just 3 days to read this mountain landscape. Raven understood that he wasn't going there to help the police. He could feel the lie, like the earth trembling before an avalanche. And this lie disrupted the balance of his world. He felt that Kuznetsov had not been killed for money or power, but to hide something more fragile, more personal. The truth that Kuznetsov had tried to hide remained at the pass, and now it beckoned to him like a beacon in the pitch darkness. Ignatov breathed a sigh of relief and agreed. His visit had not been a waste of time. He held out his hand, but Voron ignored the gesture, instead taking a thick piece of deerskin from the table to wrap around the blade of his knife. His eyes reflected not the joy of a hunter, but a deep, ancient concentration. He was preparing to return to the world of men, knowing that the most dangerous lies are always hidden under the mask of the most obvious truths. Soon they left the hut. Raven, followed by Shadow like his own shadow, stepped onto the muddy road.
The motor that had brought Ignatov was now to take them to the mountains, to the pass, where the death of the official was only the first, most brutal stroke in the grand picture of the crime. The furious roar of the motor that accompanied their ascent suddenly died away, as if cut off by the thin, icy air of the highlands.
Raven and Shadow got out on a small, large gravel-paved platform, the only flat patch of ground in front of the hunting lodge. This was the start of the pass, a dangerous windswept trail leading to cloud-covered heights.
The cabin itself, squat and built of dark cedar, seemed to be pressed to the ground by the weight of the mountains. Its only terrace hung over a steep slope covered with sparse shrubs, at the bottom of which, according to the official version, Mr. Kuznetsov's life had ended. The Raven was immediately surrounded by a flurry of activity. There were at least 5 or 6 police cars here, their flashing lights, now meaningless and useless, casting blue and red reflections on the stone, wet with melting frost. People in uniform, as well as several plainclothes officers, probably detectives, were milling about at the entrance, creating confusion that, in Voron's opinion, had long since destroyed everything that could be found in the center. Ignatov, who appeared from around the corner of the house, was pale and looked even more exhausted than he had in the hut. He tried to approach to begin his explanation, but Voron raised his hand without looking at him, and this gesture, casual and absolute, stopped the chief of criminal investigation mid-sentence. Voron ignored him, ignored the frozen detectives, ignored the cordon and the body itself, which had already been taken away, but whose location was marked by ridiculous bright flags. He did not look at the house, evidence of someone else's life, or at the terrace, the site of the alleged fall. His gaze, sharp and calm, was fixed on the ground. He began his reading from the farthest point, the driveway, where mud mixed with gravel, creating a canvas on which every footprint, even the lightest, told a story. The Shadow, as always, kept 2 steps behind, his presence as quiet and inevitable as the shadow cast by a tall tree. He wasn't looking for the scene of the crime, because he knew that the official scene of the crime was always fake if lies were involved. He was looking for the entry point, the perimeter, that invisible boundary that had been violated by people with their alien bustle. Almost immediately, his attention was drawn to the footprints left by heavy army boots, undoubtedly belonging to Kuznetsov's guards. These footprints led from the house to the road, and back, and then to the house again. At first glance, it looked like a routine patrol, or perhaps frantic footsteps after the discovery of the tragedy. But Voron crouched down, bringing his finger to the very edge of the print, where the edge of the sole had pressed into the fine sand, and then been covered by a thin film of meltwater that had frozen again. A patrolman's footsteps are always uniform, monotonous. The length of the step, the depth of the print, the angle of the foot's turn, all reflect boredom, routine, and consistency. The patrolman walks, looks around, and his path is, in essence, a closed circle. But the footsteps that Raven read were different. They were jagged, like a line written with pauses and corrections. First, they were concentrated too close to the house itself, where a person, if he was sure that his master was resting safely, should not have been. Second, there were too many of them. Raven counted them without looking at the ground, simply feeling the rhythm of their repetition.
No less than 4 complete cycles of approach and retreat. Back and forth. Back and forth.
"These are not the steps of a patrol," Raven said, his voice so quiet that only Shadow, standing closest to him, could hear it. "These are the steps of a return. A patrol leaves to return in an hour."
But these people approached and moved away from the house at intervals that were too short for a patrol, but too long for a frantic reaction. These were the actions of people who had done something, moved away to think or wait for orders, then returned to fix something, moved away again, and so on. It was not a sequence of inspection, but of staging. Raven walked over one of the footprints, lightly touching its edge with the toe of his boot. He felt the tension that had gripped his body since he learned of the lie ease slightly. He had found the first crack. He straightened up again, looking around at the frozen police officers who were staring at him with poorly concealed skepticism. They were looking for drag marks, bloodstains, a carelessly discarded rifle. In other words, direct, tangible evidence confirming the version of murder or accident. But Voron was looking for the structural lies left behind by those who try to create a false reality. And those lies were woven into the rhythm of the footsteps. According to the official version, Kuznetsov died alone, and the guards who found him immediately called for backup. If that were true, there would have been only 3 sets of footprints on the ground. Kuznetsov's own, if he had gone outside, those of the first security guard who found him, and those of the police who arrived later. But here, long before Ignatov's arrival, someone had created a complex choreography, a kind of dance of despair, and attempts to cover their tracks. Voron turned to Ignatov, who had finally decided to come closer, his face expressing a mixture of hope and fear. "Kuznetsov was supposed to rest alone, Ignatov. That's what you told me. Rest, isolation, nature. Why then did the guards make 4 circles around the house itself during... How long before your arrival? 6 hours? 7? 4 cycles of return. That's not a patrol, that's preparation." Ignatov couldn't see it because he was looking through the eyes of a lawyer. He saw the imprints of boots and the shape of their soles. Voron saw movement, intention, an internal struggle that left its mark, not in the form of dirt or blood, but in the form of a disruption in rhythm. "If this was an accident," continued Voron, folding his arms across his chest, his gaze fixed on the snow-covered, silent peaks surrounding the pass, "then it must have been unexpected and final." Why were the guards so close to the cottage when, according to their own words, the official was supposed to be left to his own devices? Either they were monitoring him, or they knew what was going on inside and were waiting for their moment. And this question, simple but devastating, pierced the entire structure of the official version. A vacationing official, a secluded cottage, and guards as vigilant as hawks, who repeated their route to the threshold and back, as if trying to make sure their job was done cleanly. It didn't look like a tragic accident. It looked like a carefully planned but clumsily executed cover-up. Justice, as Raven often thought, never began with loud statements and arrests. It always began with a quiet, almost imperceptible lie that someone tried to imprint on solid, incorruptible ground. And in this mountain landscape, which was supposed to be stable and immovable, the first gaping crack had already been discovered. Voron knew that now that he had identified the lie on the perimeter, it was time to go inside, where the lie was bound to be even denser and more viscous. He nodded to Tenny and headed for the cabin, leaving Ignatov standing on the cold, deceitful ground of the pass. Raven entered the hunting lodge, where city detectives were finishing their superficial work, packing items into sterile bags with the pedantry that usually accompanies the desire to close a case rather than solve it. Inside, there was a heavy, mixed smell of cheap hotel soap, stale tobacco smoke, and something pungent, probably a carpet cleaner that the police had used to remove unnecessary traces before the experts arrived. The fire in the stove, cooled to a grey ash, added to the atmosphere of abandonment. Voron did not pay attention to the place where Kuznetsov was supposed to have lain after the accident with the weapon. He knew that everything related to the body and blood had already been manipulated and misinterpreted. The real truth always hides in the periphery, in what seems unimportant and mundane. His gaze, indifferent to large objects, stopped at a small square table made of rough but well-polished wood. On it, among the papers left by the investigators and a forgotten flashlight, stood a glass. It was the most ordinary glass, unremarkable except for its perfect, unnatural cleanliness. It had barely been touched. There was no more than a third of water in it, and there was not a single trace of lips or fingerprints on the inside. But what really caught Voron's attention was the thinnest drop frozen on the side of the glass, just above the surface of the water, like a tiny teardrop. Although it was in the warmth of the room, this drop did not spread or evaporate, but retained its spherical shape. Voron leaned over the table, his shadow covering the glass. Next to this frozen drop was a barely noticeable frost, a thin cloud of hoarfrost that quickly melted in the warm air, but still managed to leave a trace. Such microscopic frost in a closed, heated room could only have occurred for one reason. The glass of water had been brought into the house from very cold weather, literally from the frost. And this had happened very recently, long before Kuznetsov's body was discovered. Voron imagined the scene. Someone had brought a glass filled with icy, almost frozen water here. Why? Even if the official had been thirsty, he would not have drunk such water. Kuznetsov, as Ignatov knew, was a man of habit. He drank only warm, purified water brought in a thermos. The water in the glass, clean and icy, was in itself a lie that violated the order of everyday life. Voron carefully lifted the glass, his fingers touching the still cold surface. He held it up to the light to examine the water. The water was so clear that it seemed distilled. "Clean water," he whispered, addressing not the shadow, but the very truth that this silent object carried within itself. Pure water that carried the secret of dirty hands. Perhaps it was needed to dilute something, poison, medicine, to make the effect imperceptible. Or, more likely, it was needed to quickly wash something away without leaving a trace. In a mountain cabin, where water from a spring always leaves natural sediments and microscopic particles of silt, such perfect water was a foreign element. He put down the glass and began to read the floor. The unvarnished wooden boards had absorbed years of human presence. But now, they were telling a new story. Moving slowly, barely touching the floor with the toe of his boot, Raven discovered several groups of small, inconspicuous stains. They had been carefully wiped away, but not completely, because human memory always fails in the details. These stains, arranged in a chaotic order, were traces of that very pure water. Someone had spilled water and hurried to wipe it up, but did so inefficiently, relying on the fact that no one would be looking for perfect cleanliness. Raven crouched down, barely touching the floor with his finger. The sensation was faint, but he caught it. The wood fibers in these places were slightly raised,
indicating that they had been wiped against the grain, nervously and hastily.
Water is the only trace that man has not learned to control perfectly, thought Raven. Blood can be washed away, fingerprints can be erased, traces can be covered up, but water, penetrating the pores of the wood, leaves behind a trace of purity, which, in conditions of natural dirt, becomes the most vivid evidence of falsification. If the water had been spilled accidentally, it would have been wiped away carelessly, without any attempt to hide it. But these traces had been wiped away neatly, but not thoroughly enough, which indicated a conscious action, an attempt to hide the fact of the spill or the use of this water, and the icy temperature of the water suggested that it had been brought from somewhere outside, possibly specifically for this purpose. Voron glanced around the room.
The forensic expert smiled ironically as they watched him. A taiga hermit examined the spilled water and the glass. But it was precisely in this irony that their mistake lay. They were looking for a crime, while Voron was looking for a lie.
He had already found it in the security guard's footsteps, and now he found it in the everyday details. The two unnatural patterns around the cabin and the clean, icy water inside pointed to the same thing. Someone had been working here, covering their tracks, and they had done it quickly, with a nervousness that always leaves behind small but irrefutable clues. He approached Shadow. "Find out where this water came from," Raven said quietly. "It shouldn't smell of iron or swamp. It must be from a mountain spring, and it must be ice cold, even if it was carried here in the warmth."
Shadow left without asking any questions. He knew that in the highlands, every stream, every spring had its own unique smell and taste.
A city person wouldn't notice this, but Shadow was part of this world. Left alone, Raven turned his attention from everyday objects to Kuznetsov's belongings, preparing to read his last silent confession, sewn into the fabric of his clothes and the order of his things. He understood that clean water was only a tool. But now that he knew of its existence and its origin, he could understand the purpose of its use. It was the first thread leading from dirty hands to a secret hidden in the mountains. Left alone, Raven allowed himself the luxury of a slow, detailed inspection. The cabin was small, divided into two parts: a common room dining room with a stove and a sitting area, and a small bedroom, separated by a thick cedar partition. It was here, in this private space, that he hoped to find a trace of Kuznetsov's last unspoken thought. The city investigators had left chaos behind, but it was a controlled chaos that they themselves had created, trying to find what they were looking for, and not notice what could compromise them. Voron ignored their traces, like the sound of the wind, and focused on the language of things, a silent but extremely honest language that cannot lie. His gaze fell first on the bed. The blanket was carelessly thrown back, the pillow slightly crumpled. It looked as if Kuznetsov had just gotten up, but there was a certain falseness in this carelessness. A man who had come to the highlands for rest and was rumored to have a pedantic character would not have left the bed in such a state if his death had come suddenly on the slope, or while cleaning his weapon. Moreover, Voron noticed that the sheet was stretched too tightly, as if someone had tried to smooth it out quickly and roughly. If Kuznetsov had jumped out of bed himself, his movements, like his death, would have left a more natural, crumpled trace. Here, however, there was an attempt to create an imitation of life that had been interrupted. Here he was sleeping, and then he went about his business. But Kuznetsov was no longer asleep when he was killed. Voron moved to the corner where, according to official reports, the official's personal belongings were located. Here lay neatly folded expensive clothes for the city,
woolen trousers, a cashmere sweater, and even an almost new, unworn scarf. Everything was folded, as if waiting to be packed. These clothes suggested that Kuznetsov was not going to wear them for a walk or a hunt. He was going to return to the city.
Either he was killed before he had time to get ready, or, more likely, his belongings were folded after his death to reinforce the version of a walk that ended tragically. However, next to this immaculate pile was an item that stood out from the rest.
The boots, heavy, leather, with thick corrugated soles, necessary for mountainous terrain, were not simply standing in the corner, but were set apart from the rest of the clothing, their soles covered with caked, dark mountain mud.
If the official had really intended to go out on the slope, he would have worn these shoes.
If he had already been on the slope when the accident occurred, his clothes, especially the lower part of his trousers, would have been stained, just like his boots. But his trousers, folded in the corner, were clean and immaculate.
This led to the conclusion that the boots were placed there to create a logical bridge between the clean house and the dirty slope.
Someone had taken Kuznetsov's clean outer clothing, folded it neatly, and then, after his death, put the dirty boots on him, or simply placed them near the scene of the staged accident.
Voron leaned over the boots, peering at the structure of the dirt. It was dry and crumbly, indicating that these were traces from yesterday, traces of his first and only trip to the pass. Then Raven approached the stove.
It was here, in the heart of the cottage, where the fire was supposed to bring warmth and peace, that he looked for signs of outside interference. He opened the cast-iron door, his gaze plunging into the abyss of ashes and unburned coals. The stove had been lit, that much was obvious. But Raven, who had spent most of his life by the fire, knew how wood burned and how it turned to ash. The time of kindling could usually be determined by the structure of the coals and the layers of ash.
Here, however, the ashes seemed to be mixed up. The lower, older layers were mixed with the upper, fresher coals, and this had been done not with a poker during combustion, but with something flat, after the fire had almost gone out.
The Raven carefully began to remove the coals using a thin stick. Some of them were too dry, not matching the moisture content of wood that was usually stored in the highlands.
It looked like dry wood had been added after the main wet logs had burned out. Why? To create the appearance of prolonged burning, or to quickly destroy something that required high temperatures.
He wasn't looking for bullets or metal. He was interested in something else. Organic matter, paper, things that people burn in a hurry to get rid of evidence. And he found it.
In the very center of the pile, barely smoldering and almost merged with the ashes, lay the thinnest, twisted scraps of paper. These were not newspaper scraps or packaging. The Raven carefully unfolded one of them using the tip of a knife.
The paper was thick, expensive, with an embossed edge. And on the back, despite the charring, the remains of a typographic print were visible. A small official font, characteristic of reports or financial documents.
The paper had been burned, but not completely. It had been done impatiently and carelessly, in a hurry. Whoever destroyed these papers did not wait for them to burn completely, and tried to hide the remains by simply mixing them with the ashes. This confirmed his earlier hypothesis about the steps of return. The lie was multi-layered. First the murder, then the attempt to destroy the evidence inside the cottage, burning papers, spilled water, and only then staging an accident on the slope.
The clothes folded in the corner, the clean sheet,
the mixed ashes. All these were signs of someone else's presence, which they tried to erase by imposing a false, implausible narrative on the objects.
Kuznetsov's belongings told a story of how he was preparing to leave but was interrupted. And then, after his death, his body was taken out into the cold to create an alibi for the killer. The Raven moved away from the stove, his face remaining impassive, but inside him, a clear, logical chain of events was already forming. He had found lies in everyday life, and these lies were far more eloquent than any fingerprints. If things had learned to speak, then it was time to look for the loudest clue, the trace left in nature itself. He looked at Shadow, who had returned, his gaze a silent question. Shadow just nodded. The water, ice-cold and crystal clear, came from a spring located behind the cottage, in a ravine. This meant that the killer had not only murdered and staged the scene, but also taken care to keep his hands clean by making an extra dangerous trip to the spring at a time when every second counted. The Raven left the cottage, where the language of things had already whispered to him about the lie. Now he needed confirmation from nature itself.
He knew that a person trying to hide a crime could control their hands, but they could not control the shadow cast by their desperate haste. The mountain landscape, which seemed immutable, had to contain an instability, a trace that could only be left by a foreign, awkward act. His path lay toward the slope that was officially considered the site of the tragedy. Ignatov and his men had already left this area, leaving it to Voron as a field they considered empty. The shadow, following an unspoken order, led him along a path that skirted the cottage and led to a steep cliff. This path was narrow, overgrown with low-growing gnarled cedar trees. It was here, on the border between human habitation and wild nature, that traces most often left unnoticed by people were found. They are preoccupied with the center, but do not see the periphery. The Raven walked slowly, his gaze not darting about, but gliding over the ground, over stones, over branches, as if he were reading letters in an ancient text carved in stone.
Soon Shadow stopped. He didn't say a word, just pointed his stubby, calloused finger at a small cedar bush right at the edge of the trail. A branch extending from the main trunk was broken. This was a common occurrence in the mountains, where winds and snowfalls raged, and most branches were bent or cracked naturally. But this branch was different. Raven moved closer and crouched down, examining the break. It was broken downward, not sideways, as if by a strong gust of wind, and it was not broken by a sharp, tearing motion, as if by the claws of a large animal. The break was clean but not smooth, indicating that a large but blunt force had been applied from above, causing the wood fibers to tear slowly and painfully. If the branch had been broken naturally, it would have cracked under the weight of snow, or bent under the force of the wind, and the vector of force would have been horizontal, or from top to bottom, but parallel to the slope. Here, however, a vertical load had obviously been applied, not by nature, but by a human being. Such a break could only have occurred in one case. A person carrying something heavy, perhaps a body, on their shoulder or back, tried to walk along a narrow path and was unable to squeeze through, catching the branch. The weight of the load, the pressure, and the need to move forward led to this unnatural downward break. The branch, broken neither by wind nor animal, became a silent witness to the crime. It was the instability in the mountain landscape that Verona Ignatov had asked for. The mountain cedar, known for its elasticity and ability to withstand heavy loads, succumbed not to the force of nature, but to the weight of lies and human fear. If Kuznetsov had really fallen down the slope, he would have left traces of dragging, of struggling for his life, knocked down leaves and branches broken in a chaotic, jagged order. But this branch, broken downward, spoke of a conscious transfer of weight, of a route chosen for secrecy rather than for rescue. The raven cautiously raised its head, surveying the space around it. The path was covered with a thin layer of gravel and clay. According to the logic of the staging, this was where Kuznetsov's body should have been carried to the edge of the cliff, where it was found. Voron knew that a person carrying a heavy load always tries to walk closer to the edge of the path to maintain balance. He saw that a few meters from the broken branch, at the very edge where the path bordered the rock, there was a slightly deeper than usual footprint. It was not a patrol step, but a footprint left under additional weight. The sole was pressed deeper than the weight of one person would allow, and the direction of the footprint pointed not to the slope, but from the hut to the place of the alleged fall. The official's body was moved to the scene of the accident after his death, he concluded, based on the state of the cottage, and now he had found material confirmation of this in the landscape itself. It was direct, irrefutable evidence that the city detective, with his sterile methods, would never have found. Because to do so, one must not simply look, but read nature, know its natural rhythm, in order to notice the slightest deviation. The unnatural break in the cedar branch was louder than any scream. The raven ran his hand over the broken surface, feeling the strength and at the same time the fragility of the wood fibers. There was a philosophical truth in this break. A big lie always requires violence against the natural order. To hide the murder, they had to break the laws of equilibrium, forcing the cedar, which stretches upward, to break downward. It was like the silent intervention of fate, which always leaves a trace so that the truth can be found. The shadow, who was watching him, made no comment, but his eyes showed deep understanding. The shadow, like the raven, lived by the laws of the tiger, where there was no place for falsehood. They both knew that Kuznetsov had been killed in the cabin, and now all that remained was to understand why the killer had chosen this particular path to carry the body, and what had made him rush so much that he had failed to notice a detail so obvious to an attentive eye. Voron stood up, his gaze fixed on the very edge of the cliff where, according to the official version, Kuznetsov had fallen. Now he knew that it was not a fall, but a dump, and his next step would be to understand the psychology of those who staged this scene and why they acted with such nervous, chaotic haste. Voron settled in the common room of the cottage, in the very spot where a glass of ice water had stood just a short time before. He asked Ignatov to call the two guards who had been on duty the night of the murder, and to remove everyone else from the room. The officers responsible for Mr. Kuznetsov's security entered the room with varying degrees of preparedness for the encounter. The senior officer, a strong man of about 35, named Sergei, carried himself with confidence, his posture deliberately relaxed, which, in itself, was a sign of tension. The second, Pavel, was younger, with a pale face and eyes that darted around the room, lingering on neither any object nor Voron's face. The fear in his eyes was not the fear of guilt, but the fear of a witness who had seen too much and was now trying to hide what he had seen behind a thick veil of silence. Voron did not offer them a seat, forcing them to stand at a distance from the table, which immediately put them in an uncomfortable, psychologically subordinate position. He did not introduce himself or explain the purpose of his presence. There was no place in his method for direct confrontation or legalese. He began not with events,
but with the environment, with the very nature that, in his opinion, always remains honest, even when a person lies desperately.
"Tell me about the sounds of that night," Raven asked quietly, his voice dull and steady, like the flow of an underground river. "Not about the shots or the screens. Tell me about what must have been heard in the silence, the snow, the wind, the animals. What did you hear when you went out to the perimeter?" He deliberately avoided questions that had already been answered in the reports. He asked them to describe not facts, but feelings, things that cannot be memorized, and that remain in the memory only as a pure, undistorted impression.
Sergei, the calmer of the two, immediately accepted the challenge, as if it were a game in which he had to demonstrate his powers of observation.
He began to speak, and his speech flowed with excessive detail, with literary insertions that betrayed a memorized script that had been played over and over in his mind.
He described the movement of the moon over the pass, specifying that it was almost full and that its light fell in a smooth, silvery path on the snowy peaks. He recounted in detail that the wind was blowing from the north, bringing with it a biting, dry frost, and that they went out on patrol at exactly midnight and at 2:45 a.m.
He even mentioned that he heard an eagle-owl hoot once, and how the sound pierced the dead silence of the night.
His story was flawless, complex, like a well-oiled machine in which every detail was in place. Voron listened without interrupting, his gaze fixed not on Sergei but on Pavel, who stood nearby, his lips pressed into a thin line and his eyes downcast. Pavel remained silent, even when Sergei paused, as if waiting for his confirmation. He only nodded slightly, sometimes a little earlier than would have been natural.
Voron saw in this silence not a reluctance to speak, but a numbness, a psychological shock that prevented the young man from participating in the creation of this grandiose lie.
Sergei spoke of the moon and the wind like an amateur poet, but his words did not carry the weight of true memory. It was excessive detail, which is usually a sign of a memorized story. A person who really remembers makes mistakes, pauses, confuses times, but never talks about a silver path in the protocol. Voron interrupted Sergei mid-sentence when he began to describe how the ice cracked on the rocks. "Okay, Sergei, tell me, how many times did you leave the cabin between midnight and 4 in the morning? Not for patrol, just to go out and come back." Voron asked the question based on the return steps he had read on the ground. Sergei faltered. His smooth script had failed. He glanced quickly at Pavel, then, gathering himself, said, "Twice, as required. Patrol." "No," Voron corrected quietly. "From the tracks I saw, you went back and forth at least 4 times. What was that for?" Sergei's face darkened. His confidence began to melt away like frost in the sun. It was official business. We were checking the perimeter. Maybe not 2, but 3 times. But
It was all official business, Sergei mumbled, his voice losing its melodic confidence. Voron looked at Pavel again. "Pavel," he said to the silent guard, "were you with him all 4 times?" Pavel looked up. There was such deep, quiet panic in his eyes that Voron sensed this was the weak link he was looking for. Pavel had not participated in the dirty work itself. He was only a witness who had been ordered to remain silent. He did not lie like Sergei and was unable to recite the memorized phrases. His body began to tremble,
and he only shook his head, refusing to give a direct answer, but confirming it non-verbally.
Sergei's excessive detail and Pavel's absolute silence became two sides of the same lie for Voron. Sergei was the architect of the falsification, a man who believed he could outsmart nature and truth by creating the perfect verbal report.
Pavel was just a frightened executor of someone else's will, and his fear was purer and more honest than all of Sergei's lies. He was afraid not so much of the consequences of the official's death as of those who forced him to remain silent and participate in this charade.
Voron realized that further questioning of Sergei was useless.
He would stick to his story to the end, defending not himself, but the web of lies he had created. "All right," said Voron, releasing Sergei. "You can go."
"But you, Pavel, stay."
Ignatov, standing in the doorway, tensed, but remembering Voron's conditions, did not intervene. Sergei hurried out, leaving Pavel alone, as if he had thrown off an extra burden. Voron approached Pavel.
"I know you didn't kill Kuznetsov." His voice softened, almost fatherly. "But you saw his body being carried out. You saw someone bring a glass of ice-cold, clean water to the cabin before dawn."
"I saw traces of water on the floor, Pavel."
"Water is the only trace that a person cannot control, and you know where it came from." It was a statement, not a question.
Voron did not press him. He simply showed that the truth was already known, and that his silence was now useless and dangerous.
Pavel stood broken,
His eyes fixed on the floor where, invisible to everyone except Voron, a trail of clean water was visible. And this water, a symbol of innocence, had now become the heaviest stone for him.
Evening fell in the highlands abruptly and without warning,
Like a curtain lowered by an invisible hand over the stage of daytime bustle,
the dark, shaggy
peaks of the mountains, which had seemed bronze in the morning, now took on a deep blue hue, and the air, deprived of the sun's warmth, became sharp and penetrating.
Raven and Shadow moved several hundred meters away from the hut,
finding shelter under an overhanging rock, where they lit a small, inconspicuous fire.
The tongues of flame, greedy and bright,
were the only living movement in this cold, silent setting. Raven sat with his legs stretched out toward the fire, not talking, not moving, allowing the silence and cold to draw out of him the remnants of city bustle and foreign lies.
He felt the earth beneath his back, firm and unshakable, restoring his own rhythm, disrupted by screams, cars, and far-fetched explanations. He didn't need Ignatov or the detectives to bring him evidence.
He had already read everything he needed to know. The unnatural rhythm of footsteps around the house, the glass of ice-cold clear water, the traces on the wooden floor that had been wiped away, but not completely, the neatly folded but unworn clothes of the official, and finally, the unnaturally broken cedar branch.
These details, scattered and seemingly unrelated, came together for him in a single, ugly pattern.
Kuznetsov was killed inside the cabin. Then his body was carried out and thrown down the slope. And the guards, acting as accomplices, tried to create an alibi that was supposed to be flawless, but turned out to be as clumsy as a child's first word. Now, staring into the fire, Voron did not ponder how the murder had happened. That was already clear. He was trying to understand why.
Murder, motivated by conflict, robbery, or passion, is always a heated, impulsive act, leaving behind traces of struggle, chaos, and easily readable traces of emotion. But here,
There was a cold, calculated lie that had nothing to do with rage.
It was a murder that was supposed to look like nature's own verdict. An accident. Natural selection. Such a handwriting does not belong to a mercenary or a random enemy.
It was the handiwork of someone close to Kuznetsov. Someone who knew his habits and knew that his death had to be clean, untainted by human intervention. And therein lay the key philosophical mystery.
Voron understood that this murder was not for profit in the literal sense. If it had been a murder for money, the criminals would have taken the valuables, created a mess to imitate a robbery, or caused damage to hide their motive.
But here, except for the burnt scraps of paper in the stove, everything remained in its place. Except for the main thing, balance. It was a murder born of fear. The killer was not afraid of Kuznetsov. There was no reason to fear a dead man. The killer was afraid of the consequences of Kuznetsov's actions. The official who had come to this secluded place to rest was actually going to do something. Turn in his accomplices, get out of the game, destroy evidence, or prepare documents for his own salvation. The burned pieces of paper in the stove are the best proof of this. This means that Kuznetsov's murder was a preemptive, desperate measure. The person who committed it must have been either his partner in shady dealings or his right-hand man. Someone who would have been doomed if Kuznetsov had survived.
And this fear was so great, so paralyzing, that it caused the killer to make mistakes. Leaving a glass of ice water, forgetting about the unnatural break in the branch, making the guards circle around the house like disturbed birds.
The shadow, who seemed to be dozing, suddenly broke the silence, his voice low like the growl of an old bear.
City fear doesn't smell, Raven. It's as clean as that water. You can't hide from it.
Raven nodded. He didn't explain his conclusions to Shadow. He just shared his state of mind. In the taiga, fear always has a smell. The smell of sweat, blood, wet fur. It is natural.
Urban fear, the fear of losing power or freedom, the fear of punishment. It is pure and silent. But it is precisely this fear that causes a person to break the natural order of things, leaving behind instability. The psychological tension of that.
Night was more palpable than the cold.
It was a clash of two worlds. The world of natural justice, where every action has an equal reaction, and the world of human morality, where lies can be covered up with pretty words and official versions.
The Raven felt like a medium reading an invisible book written in the language of tracks, ashes, and water.
Each track he discovered contained not only evidence, but also a deep moral meaning. A man obsessed with saving his own skin had violated not only the law, but also the balance of the mountains.
He remembered Pavel, the frightened guard who couldn't lie about the 4 cycles of return and the clean water. Pavel was an unwitting accomplice whose conscience had not yet been completely corroded by lies.
His fear was honest. It was fear of the power that had ordered him to remain silent. It was through Pavel, the weakest link in this chain, that Raven intended to break through to the truth. But first, he needed to reconstruct the exact chronology of events, to understand exactly when Kuznetsov was killed and what he was doing in his last hours. Voron stood up, brushing ash and burnt grass off himself. The fire crackled, continuing to defy the approaching darkness. Tomorrow he would return to the cottage, to piece together Kuznetsov's last day, relying on his conclusions like an archaeologist reconstructing an ancient vessel from fragments.
He had to understand what Kuznetsov had been doing with those papers, why he had prepared clean clothes, and how the killer had been able to enter and leave without arousing suspicion. The pause was over.
The philosophy of fear gave way to the cold, harsh logic of reconstructing time. Beyond the pass, shrouded in darkness, a chronology awaited him that would finally expose the lie.
The morning brought harsh, blinding light to the pass, highlighting every crack in the rock, every unevenness in the ground. The raven returned to the hunting lodge.
Now he looked at the room not as a crime scene, but as a frozen scene where he had to reconstruct the sequence of events leading to the denouement.
He distanced himself from the general clues and focused exclusively on the space where, he believed, the official Kuznetsov had spent his last fatal hours.
It was a logical leap. To understand how the body ended up on the slope, one had to understand why it was in the lodge in the first place. He started with the stove.
It was the epicenter of the panic and rush that left traces in the security guard's footsteps and in the broken branch.
Voron again pulled out those barely charred, thin scraps of expensive office paper. They had been burned carelessly, in a hurry. After reconstructing the structure, he realized that these were parts of not one, but several documents, probably financial reports or receipts that Kuznetsov had brought with him to destroy, away from prying eyes. The official had come here not to hunt, but to cover his tracks. He pieced together the picture. Kuznetsov sat here, in the silence of the cabin, next to the stove, methodically getting rid of evidence that could compromise him. It was a process that required time and concentration. It could not be interrupted spontaneously. This meant that Kuznetsov was killed at the moment when he was most vulnerable, immersed in his work, distracted by smoke and fire. His death had to be quick, silent, and unexpected, so that he would not have time to react, to scream, or even to drop the papers. This ruled out a struggle and, even more so, awkward cleaning of the weapon or an accidental fall.
The raven noticed the position of the table where he had earlier found the glass of ice water. The table was pushed up against the wall. If Kuznetsov had been sitting here burning papers, it would have been convenient for him to have the table nearby as a temporary work surface. But he was killed while in the process of destroying evidence, or, more subtly, while preparing to leave. Clean clothes folded in the corner and dirty boots set aside suggested that he planned to leave the pass as soon as he finished his dirty business. Death was quick. Most likely, the official was killed by a blow to the head or strangulation, a method that leaves little blood and noise. The medical report provided to Ignatov mentioned a head injury allegedly sustained in a fall. But Voron knew that the blow had been delivered indoors, and that the fall had been staged to explain the injury. The most important thing is time. Kuznetsov was killed inside, after which the killer began to cover up the crime. What should have happened immediately after his death? The killer had to make sure that the evidence was destroyed. That is why the ashes were mixed up. The killer hastily tried to hide the unburned pieces. Then there was the glass of water. Someone brought ice water, perhaps to dilute the remains of some substance, or, conversely, to quickly clean their hands or the murder weapon, avoiding traces of warm tap water that could reveal recent use. And this stage, the murder and concealment of evidence inside the cottage, had to take place before the guard who discovered the accident began to act. If the guard had found the body immediately, there would have been no time for a thorough cleanup. This meant that the killer must have been either one of the guards or someone whom the guards had let through, and who was acting in coordination with them.
The return steps on the street finally convinced Voron. The guards knew what had happened. They approached the cottage and moved away from it, following instructions or waiting for orders while the cleanup was taking place inside. Voron went into the bedroom, glancing again at the tightly stretched sheet and folded clothes. He reconstructed the scenario. Kuznetsov was sitting at the table, burning papers. At that moment, his killer entered. A person he trusted, or a person who had the right to be there. The murder happened quickly. The killer hurriedly checked the stove, stirred the ashes, and wiped away traces with clean water, trying to get rid of invisible chemical or biological residues that could indicate his presence. He quickly folds clean clothes to give the impression that Kuznetsov was not going anywhere, or, conversely, was preparing to return to the city. The last, most brutal and desperate stage is the removal of the body. It is this stage that left the most obvious trace, an unnaturally broken cedar branch. The killer had to carry Kuznetsov's body out, put dirty boots on him, and then throw him off the slope, staging a fall. All this had to happen before Sergei, the chief liar among the guards, began to play out his charade of discovering the body and calling the police. The lie was woven into the chronology itself. First, the murder and cleanup, then the staging, and only then the official announcement of the accident. Voron felt how this whole picture, assembled from the smallest, invisible details, took on density and volume. The killer didn't just want to hide the crime. He wanted it to look like an inevitable, natural outcome. It was a murder of prevention, a murder of fear. Now that he knew when and how Kuznetsov had been killed and why it had been done, the simplest thing remained: to find what was missing from this picture, the murder weapon and the person who had used it.
After Voron reconstructed the chronology of the murder, the destruction of evidence, the quick killing inside the cabin, the cleanup, the removal of the body, and the staging of the fall, his focus shifted. Now he was looking for something that should have disappeared forever, but left a barely discernible trace of its presence. He returned to the main room of the cottage, where hunting and fishing equipment was stored.
It was a small storeroom that smelled of machine oil, gunpowder, and the stale smell of resin. In this cramped space, among dozens of items, each with its own natural smell, he searched for a foreign element.
The Raven was not interested in the rifle, which was officially listed as the weapon of the accident. He knew that the weapon had been planted, and that all the tests conducted by the city forensic experts would focus on it, diverting attention
From the real murder weapon. His goal was different: to find the object that had been used to strike or strangle the victim, and then carefully cleaned of any traces. He methodically examined what must have been used for purposes other than hunting.
As Voron had already figured out, the official Kuznetsov had been killed while working with documents, not during his leisure time. Therefore, Voron focused on simple but heavy objects that could have been at the killer's disposal.
His gaze fell on a rack with hunting knives and axes. Among them was a massive hunting knife with a wide blade and a light wood handle. The knife was perfectly polished, so perfectly that it looked unnatural in a hunting lodge, where any steel was bound to have traces of oil, grease, or at least a slight patina. Raven picked up the knife. The cold steel felt like an object deprived of its natural warmth in his hand. He held the blade up to the light coming through the only window. No stains, no scratches, not even microscopic traces of rust. The knife was clean. Too clean. A hunter or fisherman who had used the knife would surely have greased it, leaving a thin,
oily trace. Here, however, there was absolute, sterile cleanliness, which could only be achieved in one way: by careful, nervous scrubbing.
He slowly brought the blade to his face, covering his eyes, and took a deep breath, trying to catch the invisible trace, the imprint of a warm wind. At first, he smelled only cold steel and wood.
Then, a faint, almost fleeting aroma cut through this neutral range. It was a light, barely noticeable smell, not of blood, flesh, or resin, but of alkali. The smell of something like soap solution, or even weakly concentrated soda.
In the world of traces that Raven reads, it was a discovery. If the knife had been used for natural purposes, cutting game or cooking food, it would have been cleaned with plain water and then, perhaps, greased. But alkali,
The faint, almost imperceptible smell of alkali suggested that it had been used for something clean, and then an attempt had been made to wash away the foreign smell. It was an attempt at sterilization that left its own, no less incriminating trace.
the killer may have used the knife not as a cutting weapon, but as a blunt weapon, to strike a blow, or more likely, to quickly cut a rope or cloth with which Kuznetsov could have been strangled, or to open something related to documents.
But why the alkali? Alkaline solutions are used to neutralize strong organic odors, but they can also be used to destroy very subtle chemical or biological traces that remain after contact with skin or fibers from someone else's clothing.
The killer didn't just want to remove the blood, of which, apparently, there wasn't much, since death was probably caused by suffocation or a strong blow. He wanted to destroy the presence. He wanted to wash away his own fingerprint from the knife.
Voron put the knife back on the rack. He knew that this knife had been used. It was perfectly clean, but this cleanliness was feigned, false, like a liar's smile. Cleanliness in the taiga, as in the human soul, always has a natural tinge.
Perfect cleanliness was the imprint of a stranger's hand, which tried in a hurry to erase its own presence. It was the imprint of a warm wind, a trace left by a nervous, hasty gesture. Next to the knives, on a narrow wooden shelf, lay an old first aid kit. Acting intuitively, Raven opened it. Among the bandages and antiseptics, he found a small, almost empty bag of dry sodium bicarbonate, ordinary baking soda.
The bag was slightly open, and only a handful of white powder remained inside. Voron took the bag, his finger touching the barely noticeable stickiness on the paper. Baking soda diluted in ice-cold water, brought from the spring, produced the same weak alkaline solution that was used to sterilize the knife. The whole picture came together. Clean water brought in a glass, a tool shed hidden behind the door, a perfectly clean knife that smelled of alkali. All of this led to one person who had free access to the shed, knew where the tools were kept, and was so frightened that he made a suicidal attempt to erase the traces with household products. Sergei, the security guard, with his rehearsed story, was too confident for such panic. The killer was someone else, someone who had a deeper knowledge of Kuznetsov and his habits. Voron left the storage room.
Now he needed to talk to Pavel, the quiet, frightened security guard who had not participated in the cover-up, but had seen the lies.
The knife, baking soda, and clean water were irrefutable evidence for Raven. But for the city folks, they were only circumstantial clues. To turn them into the truth, He needed to find a living witness whose conscience had not yet hardened. He knew that Pavel, seeing that Voron knew about the water, would break, like the cedar branch that had been broken to carry the body.
This was not only the logic, but also the ethics of his investigation. Truth always lies in fear, and redemption in confession. Voron summoned Pavel again. This time, neither Ignatov nor any other police officers were in the room. Only Voron, Shadow, standing silently by the stove, and Pavel himself, pale as high mountain frost.
Voron knew that his power now lay not in threats or accusations, but in the accuracy of his knowledge of Pavel's fear.
This young man was the weakest link, not a criminal, but a witness, whose silence had been bought with fear. "I will not ask you what you saw," Voron began, his voice devoid of any intonation, making his words sound like a sentence pronounced by the mountain itself. "I know you saw the body being carried out. I know you saw the glass of clean, ice-cold water. You are the only one of the guards who did not participate in this stupid comedy that Sergei staged. Your guilt is not in murder, but in concealment. And your silence, Pavel, in the mountains, is as much a lie as the words of your partner." Pavel swallowed. He didn't try to deny it. His numbness was the best confirmation. Voron walked around the table and stopped right in front of him.
"Show me the path to the spring, the place where you brought the clean water from. You went there for it.
Otherwise, you wouldn't know that it's so cold. Raven wasn't asking. He was giving an order that was supposed to break Pavel's psychological barrier. Movement is always easier than words. Physical action pulls a person out of a stupor. The guard, as if obeying an ancient, unspoken order, nodded slowly, and without saying a word, headed for the door. Raven and Shadow followed him. The path was narrow and rocky, leading down from the house toward thick cedar thickets. Pavel walked silently, his heavy boots scraping nervously on the stones. He led them, not to the official water source, but to a small, inconspicuous spring where water flowed directly from the rock, so cold that a thin crust of ice instantly formed on its surface. When he reached the spring, Pavel finally stopped. Here, in this secluded, quiet place, the lie he carried inside him became unbearable. The water, clear and icy, symbolized the truth he had tried so hard to bury. The raven did not rush him. He just waited, looking at the spring. It was still dark, Pavel began, his voice hoarse from long silence, the words coming out with difficulty, like rocks from a landslide. "I was on duty. I saw it. It wasn't a patrol." He looked up at the raven, his eyes full of despair. "I saw him come out. Not Kuznetsov, the official's right-hand man, his assistant, who came supposedly for a vacation, as you said." Pavel paused, gathering his strength. He recounted that on that night, long before the first signs of dawn, when the moon was already setting, he saw Grigory Nikolaevich, Kuznetsov's assistant, a man who always remained in the shadow of his influential boss, come out of the house. Grigory Nikolaevich was carrying something wrapped in dark, thick fabric. It was something heavy and inflexible. Pavel couldn't make out what it was, but he realized that it wasn't ordinary luggage. He saw the official's assistant, moving unnaturally quickly and nervously, go down the slope to the very place where Kuznetsov's body was later found. He came back in about 10 minutes. Pavel continued, no longer holding back, as if confessing. He was alone. His hands were wet,
and he was in a hurry. He ordered me to keep quiet. He said that Kuznetsov
Had just fallen asleep drunk, and that I should wait until morning, when everything would calm down. Pavel didn't know that the assistant was carrying the body out. He thought that Kuznetsov had once again overdone it with alcohol and needed to be taken somewhere so as not to embarrass himself. He didn't know it was murder, but he knew it was a lie. And this lie, which he had accepted to avoid trouble, was now suffocating him. When he came back, he asked me to bring him some water, clean water. He said they had run out of drinking water in the cabin. I went here. The water was ice cold, Pavel explained, confirming the frost marks on the glass. When I brought it, he took it and quickly returned to the cabin, without letting me in. A minute later, he came out and said that everything was fine, and that I should go back to my post. At that moment, everything fell into place in Voron's mind. The assistant needed clean, ice-cold water to quickly prepare an alkaline solution using baking soda from the first aid kit and wipe the traces off the knife. The ice-cold water was necessary so that the temperature of the water would not arouse suspicion. Warm water, unlike ice-cold water, would evaporate quickly, leaving more traces on the wood. Kuznetsov's assistant killed him to prevent the destruction of evidence that could expose him. He knew about Kuznetsov's plans, and that became his motivation. When the police arrived, he was the first to say that it was an accident. He told us that we should all say the same thing, that we heard a scream and found the body on the slope. Pavel concluded. Sergei believed him because he was paid to. And I was just scared. His fear was genuine. It was not part of the plan. It was a byproduct of it. Voron put his hand on Pavel's shoulder. You're not a murderer, Pavel. And your truth, even if it came late, is heavier than all their lies. Voron looked up at the mountains. The truth, like a spring, broke through the thick rock.
Now he had not only irrefutable circumstantial evidence, the knife, the soda, the water, but also a witness whose testimony, even under pressure, would reflect that very same pure, icy truth. There was only one thing left to do: bring charges.
Not legal charges, but moral ones. Pavel finally felt relieved. An unbearable burden had fallen from his shoulders. He had broken down, but it was a breakdown that led to redemption. Voron nodded to Tenny. Now they knew who the killer was and why he had done it. All that remained was to make him confess. Grigory Nikolaevich, the late Kuznetsov's assistant, entered the house with exaggerated dignity.
He was dressed in expensive but rumpled city clothes, his face expressing neither grief nor fear, but only fatigue and condescending irritation, which is always characteristic of a person forced to communicate with those he considers inferior to
Himself, in status. He expected to see Ignatov, perhaps a few detectives who would ask him the usual questions, and finally allow him to return to the city to begin the procedures for settling the inheritance and closing the cases. But instead, he was met by Voron. Voron sat on the only chair, his head propped up with his hand, his gaze direct and heavy, like a block of granite. Shadow stood nearby, motionless, like a sentry. Ignatov was present but kept his distance, his whole demeanor showing that he was only an unwitting witness to this meeting. Grigory Nikolaevich smiled casually, trying to convey sympathy and a willingness to cooperate.
As Konstantin Viktorovич's right-hand man, I'm ready to provide all the information.
I have already given detailed testimony to the police, describing how difficult it was for me to witness his fall from the slope.
he began, his voice steady, accustomed to public speaking. This is undoubtedly a tragedy, an accident.
Fatigue, high altitude, an unfortunate movement.
Stop, Grigory Nikolaevich, Voron interrupted him. His words sounded not like an order, but like a sudden bell ringing in the silence. The official's assistant faltered. Voron did not accuse him of murder. He did not mention the knife or the soda. He began with what was most important to him. I am not accusing you of breaking the law of the city. I am accusing you of breaking the law of the taiga, of concealment and lies. It is lies, Grigory Nikolaevich, that have upset the balance of this pass. And nature, unlike your accomplices, never forgives lies. Grigory Nikolaevich frowned, his condescension replaced by bewilderment. I don't understand what you're talking about. What laws of the taiga? I came here on business. Kuznetsov was on vacation. I regret his death. You killed him out of fear, not rage, Voron said quietly, and this emotionless phrase sounded like an irrefutable fact. You knew that Kuznetsov didn't come here to relax. He came to burn documents, to get out of the game, to turn you and your accomplices in. He was burning them in the furnace when you walked in. You killed him preemptively to take what he hadn't had time to destroy. You killed him not for profit, but for self-preservation. Voron stood up and, without touching anything, began to point out the invisible traces he had been reading for 2 days. The security guard's footsteps, Grigory Nikolaevich, 4 cycles of approaching and retreating from the house before the police arrived. Your men, unable to lie in unison, betrayed your fear. They waited for you to do your dirty work inside. Steps of return, not patrol. You moved to the table. Clean water, ice cold, brought by you from the spring before dawn. It was needed to wash your own foreign smell off the knife, to hide the traces of alkali you found in the first aid kit. All the water evaporated, but the invisible trace of your panicked desire to erase yourself remained on the tree. Then he pointed to the most obvious but most overlooked clue, the unnatural break in the cedar branch growing on the path to the slope. Broken downwards, not sideways, as a branch might be broken by someone carrying something heavy on their shoulder and unable to squeeze through. You were carrying Kuznetsov's body. You threw it off the slope to make it look like a fall. Grigory Nikolaevich flinched. His mask of calm collapsed, leaving only animal fear on his face. He looked at Voron, unable to understand how this man, without instruments or expertise, could see what was hidden from the eyes of the police. Voron did not see the body, but he saw the soul of the crime, fear that cannot control itself. Your motive is fear, Grigory Nikolaevich. Kuznetsov was a threat to you, which you eliminated in order to take his documents and preserve your position, Voron said, without raising his voice. But you didn't take into account that lies in the highlands leave a mark that cannot be washed away with clean water or erased with memorized words. Nature does not tolerate imbalance. At that moment, Pavel, whom Voron had asked to stand outside the door, entered the room. He did not say a word, but his presence, his pale but determined face, became the final, irrefutable proof. Grigory Nikolaevich, seeing his guard, realized that his lie had finally collapsed. Pavel was a living witness who had seen both the bag with the body and the icy water. Now you understand, concluded Voron. I am not a prosecutor to demand your punishment.
But I know that you have violated a code that is higher than yours. You killed out of fear, and that fear will now be your main prison. He moved away from the official's assistant, signaling to Ignatov that the performance was over. The balance had been disturbed, and now it had to be restored. The silence that fell in the house after Voron's words was heavy and final, like the sound of a door slamming shut.
Grigory Nikolaevich, who, just a minute ago, had maintained his haughty dignity, now looked like a man who had been stripped naked in the cold. His eyes darted feverishly between Voron, the imperturbable shadow, and Pavel, whose silent presence had become the final, irrefutable nail in the coffin of his carefully constructed lie. At that moment, he realized that it was not the evidence that had exposed him, but some higher, natural law, that this man from the taiga knew better than he knew the criminal code.
Ignatov, who until that moment had stood aside watching the duel, realized that his mission was accomplished. He was not fond of philosophical musings about the laws of the taiga, but he was a pragmatist.
The circumstantial evidence provided by Voron, the unnatural break in the branch, the return steps, the trail of clean water, the smell of alkali, and now a living witness, was woven into such a tight, logically sound knot that no lawyer could break it.
In court, Pavel's testimony, even taking into account his concealment, would be direct confirmation that the body had been carried out and dumped by Kuznetsov's assistant.
Grigory Nikolaevich. Ignatov's voice sounded loud and official, bringing those present back to the world of city laws.
You are under arrest on suspicion of murdering Konstantin Viktorovich Kuznetsov and falsifying the circumstances of his death. He signaled to his men, who immediately entered the house, their movements quick and professional. The official's assistant did not resist. There was no anger or remorse in his eyes, only the hopeless emptiness of realizing that he had lost. And lost not to a man, but to the truth that had seeped through his lies like water through his fingers.
Ignatov approached Voron, extending his hand.
I don't know how you do it, Voron. You weren't looking for a criminal, you were looking for… what? An imbalance? He shook his head. But you found it. This case will be high profile.
The higher-ups won't be happy, but they'll have to accept the truth you pieced together from nothing. Voron did not shake his hand, but nodded slightly. I was looking for balance, Ignatov. A man decided he could do a dirty deed and hide it under the guise of an accident, planting false clues. But every action leaves a trace, and the stronger the lie, the clearer its imprint. He broke the law of the place, and the place responded.
Voron was not talking about jurisprudence, but about the moral system in which he lived. Every lie eventually becomes obvious, because it does not correspond to the truth that surrounds it.
He walked past the bustling police officers, past the stunned Grigory Nikolaevich, who was already being led to the car. His work was done.
He had come to find instability in the mountain landscape, and, having found it, he helped the pass become stable again. Justice had been restored. But this justice was without fanfare or joy.
There was only a quiet sadness for 2 human lives, one of which had been cut short physically, and the other morally. A new day was dawning. The sun finally appeared from behind the peaks, flooding the slope and the house with cold, clear light. The fog dissipated, and the mountains once again looked immovable and eternal, their majestic silence seeming like a silent assessment of human vanity and meanness.
The raven stopped at the edge of the clearing, looking at the place where yesterday
There had been torn footprints of return.
The lies, fixed on the ground, were now disappearing, erased by time and truth. "It's time, Shadow," said the raven. He did not wait for thanks, did not listen to promises or threats. He left their affairs, their laws, their courts, and their consequences to the city folk. He had not come to put a man in prison, but to find and name the truth, thereby restoring peace to a place that could not tolerate lies.
Shadow, as always, did not say a word. He went to the car and took their few belongings.
Raven did not look back at the house where a whole life had just collapsed, and where a new, official story was now beginning. One that would never be as honest as the one written in the tracks in the snow and the water on the tree.
He turned and walked toward the taiga, where his own code, his territory, his balance awaited him. He and Shadow disappeared among the cedars as quietly and unnoticed as they had appeared, leaving behind the loud but empty bustle of the police.
The curtain fell. The story of Kuznetsov, Grigory Nikolaevich, and Pavel has now become part of the great, cold legend of the pass.
And only Raven knew that his role was not to be a detective, but to be a reader, able to catch the whispers of a broken destiny.